Good evening to all the beautiful people tuning in. I'm here to help you sleep. Please support me by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're watching from and at what time, so drop a comment below. Are you ready? Let's start with the first story.
The title of the story:
The Haunted Doll of Blackwood Mansion. Emma's eyes scanned the darkened hallway of Blackwood Mansion, her breath shallow. The old house groaned as the wind howled through the cracked windows, shaking the frames with a low, eerie creak. She had always loved the idea of living in an old house, but tonight the mansion felt different. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Lucas, who was behind her, following close behind in the dim light. He paused, his brow furrowed. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the narrow corridor, but when they looked, the hallway was empty. There were no signs of life, no intruders, just the thick layers of dust that clung to the floor and walls like cobwebs. "It's probably just the house settling," Lucas said, his voice low, trying to mask the hint of unease creeping into it. Emma wasn't convinced. She had felt it. Something was wrong with this place. The mansion had a strange energy, as if it were alive in some way, a living, breathing entity watching them. Earlier that afternoon, they had explored the attic, where they found something that would change everything. Hidden beneath a pile of old trunks and boxes, Emma discovered the doll. She'd thought it harmless at first, a quaint relic of the past. Its porcelain face was cracked, but it had an unsettling beauty, too lifelike for comfort. Its glass eyes stared back at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It was almost as if it were waiting for her to pick it up, and so she did. They'd taken it downstairs, setting it in Emma's study. At first, it seemed like a silly little curiosity, a harmless decoration for their new home. But then, things started to happen. The first sign had been subtle. Emma had left the doll sitting on her desk, but when she returned, it was no longer there. She thought she'd misplaced it, but it was sitting upright on the chair by the window, its head turned to face her. She'd brushed it off, chalking it up to her own forgetfulness. But then it happened again and again. Every night, without fail, the doll was in a different spot, always somewhere unexpected, always in her line of sight. And the whispers, soft at first, had grown louder, as if someone was calling her name from the other side of the walls. Tonight, Emma had finally had enough. She was determined to get to the bottom of it. The sounds, the whispers, the way the doll moved, it was too much. The house itself felt alive, suffocating in its silence. She and Lucas had gone back to the attic, searching for answers. Amid the clutter of forgotten objects and dusty furniture, they found an old diary. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink smudged in places. Emma opened it, and what she read made her stomach churn. The diary belonged to a child named Emily, who had once lived in Blackwood Mansion. She had written about the doll, how it was her most treasured possession. But then the entries turned darker. Emily spoke of strange noises in the night, of things moving on their own, of the feeling that she was never truly alone. In her final entry, she wrote about a terrible accident, one that had claimed her life.
Her death had been ruled an accident, but the diary hinted at something more sinister. Emily had been playing with the doll when she died. No one knew what had really happened, but the final entry spoke of a curse. The doll had taken something from her, and now it wanted something in return. That was when they realized the truth. The doll was no ordinary trinket. It was a vessel for Emily's spirit, a spirit trapped in the walls of the mansion, seeking vengeance on anyone who disturbed her resting place. The whispers grew louder as Emma read, the air thick with the presence of something that was no longer human. The doll's glass eyes stared at her from across the room, but it wasn't the same doll. It felt wrong. Its face twisted, its body contorted in a way that made her heart race. Suddenly, the house groaned again, louder this time. The floorboards beneath their feet shifted, creaking in protest. The walls seemed to close in on them. Lucas grabbed Emma's arm, his face pale. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, pulling her toward the door. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The whispers now filled the room, a cacophony of voices speaking all at once. They could no longer understand the words, only feel the rage in them. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the doll's eyes followed them, moving on its own. Suddenly, the room fell silent. Then, a voice, not a whisper, but a clear, cold command cut through the stillness. "Leave or join me." The words froze Emma and Lucas in place. Their hearts raced, their bodies trembling. They had no choice but to obey, running out of the attic, through the maze-like hallways and toward the front door. But as they reached the entrance, they turned to look back. The doll was standing in the doorway, blocking their escape. Emma screamed, but Lucas grabbed her arm. "It's not real. It's just a doll." He didn't believe it, but the terror in his voice betrayed him. With a final burst of adrenaline, they forced the door open, escaping into the night. The wind howled around them, but the house remained still. When they looked back, the mansion stood quiet and empty, its windows dark. But the doll, however, was gone. The next morning, Emma and Lucas left Blackwood Mansion for good, never speaking of what had happened. But the doll remained, waiting for the next unwitting soul to discover it.
The title of the story:
The Vengeful Spirit Inside the Porcelain Doll. Matthew Handers had always prided himself on his keen eye for rare antiques. His small dusty shop in a quiet corner of England's countryside was a treasure trove for collectors, a sanctuary
for those who appreciated the beauty of history encased in age-old wood, tarnished metal, and fragile porcelain. But it was one particular Saturday morning, at an estate sale in the forgotten village of Evershire, where he would find something that would alter the course of his life forever. The sale was held at an old manor on the outskirts of town, its crumbling exterior and ivy-clad walls a sharp contrast to the immaculate antiques on display within. Matthew was sifting through boxes of tarnished silver and chipped furniture when something caught his eye. An exquisite porcelain doll, sitting alone on a velvet cushion as if waiting for him. The doll's delicate features, its impossibly smooth skin, and the deep, haunting eyes painted with an eerie precision were unlike anything Matthew had ever seen. The craftsmanship was flawless, its expression serene, yet unnervingly lifelike. Compelled by the pull of curiosity, Matthew approached the doll. It seemed to glow under the dim light filtering through the dusty windows. He ran his fingers over the intricate details of the doll's gown, marveling at its perfect stitching. Something about it felt wrong, but in a way that intrigued him more than it repelled him. The price was steep, but it was a rare find, a collector's dream. Without hesitation, he purchased it. When the doll arrived at his home, it was placed carefully in the far corner of his study, atop a small antique writing desk. Matthew admired it, but that night, when the house grew quiet, something changed. As he settled into bed, a creaking sound echoed through the hall, slow, deliberate, like someone walking softly on old floorboards. His heart skipped, but he dismissed it as the house settling. However, as the days went by, the noises continued. Each night, they grew more distinct, more intentional. Creaking footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the study. Matthew tried to convince himself it was just the wind or perhaps the house's old timbers groaning in the cold night. But each time he woke in the dark, the footsteps seemed closer, more deliberate. Then came the first unsettling shift. When Matthew entered the study the next morning, he found the doll had moved. Its once posed arms, perfectly aligned, were now askew. Its face, beautiful, serene, seemed subtly different, as if it had taken on a strange, almost mocking expression. The smile, once soft and sweet, now appeared just a touch too wide, stretching unnaturally across its porcelain face. He told himself it was nothing more than his imagination, the doll perhaps being knocked over by a draft or some unnoticed movement. But the changes continued. The creaking footsteps grew louder, now accompanied by a soft whispering, hushed, almost unintelligible, but unmistakably human. It wasn't long before the doll's transformation became undeniable. Each morning, he found it positioned differently, its grin widening slightly with each passing day. Sometimes he could swear its eyes followed him, darkened and cold. By the end of the second week, the whispers had escalated into unintelligible muttering, echoing through the dark corners of his home. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Matthew decided to confront the doll. He stood in the dim study, staring at it with an uncomfortable resolve. The air was thick with tension, and the usual creaks of the old house seemed to hold their breath. He reached out and grasped the doll by its delicate waist, lifting it from the desk. As his fingers made contact with its cold, smooth surface, a sharp chill shot through his spine, and he froze.
A voice, soft but distinctly malevolent, whispered in his ear, "Put me down." Matthew recoiled, dropping the doll onto the floor. The sound of porcelain cracking echoed through the room, but when he looked down, the doll remained unscathed. It lay there, perfectly intact, but its once gentle smile had twisted into something grotesque, a hideous wide grin that seemed to mock him. Shaken, Matthew did some research. He scoured old town records and visited the local library, searching for any trace of the doll's origins. It wasn't long before he uncovered an old legend that sent a chill down his spine. The doll, it seemed, was not simply a rare collector's item. It was a cursed artifact. The porcelain figure was modeled after Emily, the daughter of a wealthy family who had once lived in the manor he had visited for the estate sale. Emily had been a beautiful child, beloved by all who knew her, but her life had been tragically cut short in a violent manner. She had been murdered by a jealous servant who had been wronged by the family. As the legend went, Emily's spirit had not found peace. It had been bound to the doll in a failed attempt to capture her innocence and beauty. But the spirit of Emily was not at rest. The doll had become the vessel of her vengeful wrath, and whoever possessed it would fall victim to her fury. The realization hit Matthew like a blow to the chest. The whispers, the movements, the unnatural smile, it was all part of Emily's curse, and he had unwittingly invited the spirit of a wronged child into his home. Desperation gnawed at him. He tried everything, prayers, rituals, even attempting to burn the doll. But every time it returned, its features even more contorted, its malevolent presence growing stronger. The house became a prison of creeping dread. Objects moved by themselves, mirrors warped his reflection, making him appear distorted and ghastly. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think, without hearing the soft, sinister whispers in his ears, or feeling the doll's unblinking gaze upon him. Then, in a final act of defiance, Matthew decided to rid himself of the cursed doll once and for all. He took it to the nearby woods, a dark and ancient forest that had been a burial ground for centuries. There he planned to leave the doll and let the earth swallow it whole. He believed that by destroying its link to the land, he would rid himself of the curse. But as he knelt to bury the doll beneath the thick roots of an ancient oak, a cold hand gripped his wrist. He jerked his head back in shock, his heart pounding, as he found himself staring not at the doll, but at a shadowy figure. A young girl, her pale face twisted in agony, stood before him. It was Emily, but she was no longer the sweet child she had once been. Her eyes were empty, filled with centuries of torment. "You cannot escape me," she whispered, her voice echoing through the woods. "You never could." But it wasn't until the spirit reached out to touch him that the final twist revealed itself. As the girl's fingers brushed against his skin, Matthew's world spun. His body went numb, his vision blurred, and he crumpled to the ground. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the doll, sitting alone on the forest floor, its grin wider than ever. The next morning, the doll was gone. Matthew's body was found weeks later, buried beneath the roots of the old oak tree. No one knew how he had ended up there. His shop was abandoned, the items left untouched. But one thing remained, the doll, now in the hands of a new owner, waiting to begin its next reign of terror.
The title of the story:
The Possessed Doll of the Old Toy Shop. The scent of dust and decay filled the air as Emma wandered deeper into the forgotten corner of the European town. The old cobblestone streets seemed to narrow and twist, as if guiding her toward the very thing she had not expected to find. She had been exploring the quiet town for hours, its charming architecture hiding centuries of secrets, when something caught her eye. A small shop, tucked between two towering buildings, its wooden sign barely visible under layers of grime read, "Antiques and Toys." Curious, Emma stepped inside. The door creaked with a long, eerie groan as she pushed it open. She inhaled the musty air as a dull bell jingled, signaling her presence. The shop was dimly lit, with shelves lined with forgotten relics, old toys, dusty books, and trinkets that seemed as though they had been left behind by time itself. Faded dolls with cracked faces stared blankly from their perches, their empty eyes unblinking. An elderly man, hunched and frail, sat behind a counter cluttered with more ancient artifacts. His eyes flickered up as Emma entered, but he didn't speak. The silence in the shop was almost suffocating, the only sound the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the dark recesses of the building. Emma's gaze wandered, landing on a particular doll buried beneath a pile of other forgotten toys. Its porcelain skin gleamed in the faint light, its clothes simple yet elegant, an old-fashioned dress with lace trimmings. But it was the eyes that caught her attention. They were deep, unnerving, almost as if they held a secret, watching her with an unsettling intensity. Emma shivered, but she couldn't tear her gaze away. "Is it for sale?" she asked, her voice breaking the heavy silence. The old man's eyes flickered toward her, and for a moment he seemed to hesitate. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he nodded. "It's been here a long time," he said, his voice raspy and low, as though the words were difficult to speak. "Some things are better left undisturbed." Emma's heart stooped a beat, but her curiosity overcame any sense of unease. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool porcelain of the doll. As soon as she touched it, a strange feeling washed over her, a chill that prickled her skin, but she quickly shrugged it off as nothing more than the dusty air of the shop. "I'll take it," she said, her voice filled with an unexplainable urgency. The shopkeeper's expression faltered for a moment, but he said nothing more. He wrapped the doll in old, crinkled newspaper, and with a final warning glance, he handed it to her. Emma didn't think much of it until she left the shop, the bell above the door ringing in her wake. The journey back to her home was uneventful,
but something had changed. The air felt heavier, as if the weight of the doll was somehow pressing down on her. When she stepped through the door of her house, she set the doll on a small table near the entrance, intending to admire it later. That night, things began to shift. The quiet of her room seemed oppressive, as if something was lurking just beyond her vision. Emma lay in bed, trying to sleep, but the whispers started. At first they were faint, like the rustling of wind through the trees, but as the minutes ticked by, they grew clearer. Soft murmurs, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. Emma sat up in bed, heart pounding. The whispers were coming from the direction of the table where the doll rested. She glanced toward it, but the doll remained motionless, its glassy eyes staring blankly into the darkness. It was nothing, she told herself, just her imagination running wild.
But over the next few nights, the disturbances escalated. Objects in the house began to break inexplicably. Vases toppled from shelves, lamps shattered, and mirrors cracked. Emma's parents, initially dismissing her fears, began to fall ill. Her mother suffered a bad burn while cooking, though she swore she hadn't even touched the stove. Her father stumbled down the stairs one evening, his leg twisted painfully as if something had tripped him. Emma couldn't ignore it any longer. Desperately searching for answers, she turned to the one place that seemed to offer some clue: the old toy shop. The shopkeeper's cryptic words echoed in her mind. Some things are better left undisturbed. Returning to the shop the following day, she found it exactly as she had left it. The shopkeeper was nowhere to be seen, but the dusty shelves remained, the eerie dolls staring at her from their places. She walked toward the back of the shop, and to her surprise found a small, weathered journal tucked into the corner of the counter. The cover was old, the pages yellowed with age. She began to read. The journal told a chilling story. It belonged to a woman named Marguerite, a seamstress from the town who had lived many years ago. The toy shop had once been a place of happiness, but tragedy struck when Marguerite was accused of witchcraft by the villagers. They believed she had cursed the town, and in their fury they burned her alive. But before she died, she swore revenge, vowing to haunt the town through a vessel, a doll she had created. The doll that Emma had purchased. As the days went on, Emma became more certain of the doll's dark power. The accidents grew more frequent, and her parents' health continued to deteriorate. The whispers turned into shrill voices, taunting her, promising that they would claim her next. It was as if the doll was feeding on the fear it caused. Desperate, Emma researched ways to destroy the doll, but every attempt to rid herself of it failed. She tried burning it, but the flames only grew brighter, consuming everything but the doll itself. She locked it in the attic, but it mysteriously returned to its spot on the table each morning. One night, as she sat alone in the dark, a sudden realization struck her. The doll's eyes no longer followed her. She turned slowly toward it, dread creeping up her spine. And then the twist came. The doll's expression shifted. It wasn't of malice, but of sorrow.
In that moment, Emma understood. The spirit wasn't trying to claim her soul. It had been trying to protect her. The spirit of Marguerite had been twisted by years of pain, revenge, and hatred. But now, at long last, it sought redemption. The doll's eyes softened, and Emma felt an odd sense of calm wash over her. The whispers, once haunting, now spoke of release. Emma was no longer its target. The curse, it seemed, had finally been broken. The doll, though still old and haunting in appearance, was no longer an instrument of terror. Emma placed the doll back in the attic, its eerie presence no longer a threat. Yet, as she locked the door behind her, she couldn't help but wonder, had the doll truly been possessed by a vengeful spirit, or was it merely the manifestation of something darker still? The whispers had stopped, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting, biding their time, for the day when they would return.
The title of the story:
The Cursed Doll That Cannot Be Destroyed. The wind howled through the cracks of the old house, its eerie wail causing the creaky floorboards to shudder underfoot. Olivia could hear the sound of her own breath, shallow and rapid, as she stood in front of the small, dusty box. The doll, wrapped in old newspaper, sat within, its porcelain face peering up at her from the gloom like a sinister sentinel. She had never been particularly close to her grandmother, but now, in the silence of the dimly lit attic, Olivia couldn't help but feel the weight of the inheritance she had received. The house, which had once belonged to her grandmother, seemed to groan and creak with age, every corner shrouded in shadow. Olivia had moved in only a few days ago, unable to part with the strange inheritance, despite the unsettling feeling that clung to the doll. Her grandmother had always been cryptic about it, mentioning only that it was not to be played with, and not to be disturbed. Olivia had laughed it off as just one of the eccentricities of the old woman. But now, standing alone in the attic, something about the doll sent chills down her spine. The room grew colder, and the flickering light from the overhead bulb seemed to grow dimmer with each passing second. She unwrapped the doll slowly, its porcelain skin glinting ominously in the half-light. Its glassy blue eyes stared at her unblinking, as though it could see straight into her soul. A cold shiver ran down Olivia's back as she set the doll on the nearby table. For the next few days, she tried to ignore the unsettling presence of the doll in her room, but it was always there, always watching her. At night, she began to hear faint whispers in the dark. They started as a faint murmur, barely audible, but grew louder with each passing night. Olivia, come closer. The first nightmare was like nothing she had ever experienced. She found herself standing in an ancient forest, thick fog swirling around her ankles. In the distance, a pale woman with hollow eyes beckoned her forward.
Every time Olivia tried to turn away, she felt an overwhelming surge of anger, a fury that forced her toward the woman. As she approached, the figure reached out with cold, bony fingers. The moment their hands touched, Olivia woke up in cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The nightmares continued every night, each one more vivid and more terrifying than the last. And with each nightmare, Olivia's anger grew. She found herself snapping at friends and family, unable to control the rage that bubbled inside her. The doll, meanwhile, seemed to be getting more alive. Its smile, once a faint curve, was now unnervingly wide, and its eyes, those blue eyes, seemed to follow her every movement.
Desperate to rid herself of the doll, Olivia did the only thing she could think of. She tried to burn it. She gathered some old papers and set them alight in the fireplace, placing the doll inside. The flames crackled and danced, but the doll, it didn't burn. Instead, it seemed to resist the fire, the flames curling away from it, as if the doll itself was a void, absorbing the heat. When the fire had died down, Olivia was left with the remnants of the charred wood, but the doll was untouched, sitting in the ashes as though it had never been touched by flame. Frustrated and terrified, Olivia decided to bury it. In the dead of night, she dug a hole in the garden and placed the doll deep underground. She stood over it for a moment, her breath coming in ragged gasps before she covered it with earth. That night, she slept soundly for the first time in weeks, the absence of the doll bringing a fleeting sense of relief. But when she awoke the next morning, the doll was sitting on her bed. Her heart pounded as she staggered back in shock. The doll, perfectly intact, sat at the foot of her bed, its porcelain skin glistening in the morning light, its eyes wide open, staring directly at her. This time, fear gripped her entirely. She tore through the house, searching for answers. In her grandmother's old study, she found a series of cryptic journals, pages filled with strange symbols and dark rituals. One entry caught her eye. The spirit that possesses the doll cannot be destroyed by fire or burial. It feeds on fear, and only by offering the spirit a willing host can the curse be lifted. It was then that the horrifying truth dawned on her. Her grandmother hadn't merely inherited the doll. She had trapped a malevolent spirit inside it, a spirit that had fed on her own fear, and now it was feeding on Olivia's. With trembling hands, Olivia continued to read. The journal described a ritual, a final act that could break the curse, but it was a dark, twisted ritual, one that required her to confront the spirit head-on, to offer herself willingly as the host. The price was steep. Her soul. As the whispers grew louder, almost deafening, Olivia realized there was no escape. The spirit had always been there,
waiting for her, just as it had waited for her grandmother. She could feel its presence now, cold and oppressive, closing in around her. But there was one final choice: to accept the spirit, and in so doing become one with the doll forever, or to refuse and risk the consequences of angering it further. In the end, Olivia made the only choice she could. She opened the ritual's final page and began to recite the incantation. But as she spoke the final words, something unexpected happened. The doll began to crumble. The porcelain shattered, and the once perfect face fell away in pieces. The spirit, it seemed, had nowhere to go. As Olivia collapsed to her knees, a voice whispered in her ear, not from the doll, but from the very walls of the house. "You've broken the curse, Olivia, but the price was never your soul." The room fell silent, and then a loud creak echoed from the floorboards. Something or someone was moving in the shadows.
The title of the story:
The Doll That Kills. The old Victorian house on the outskirts of Ashford was exactly what the Whiteley family needed: a fresh start. Nestled at the edge of a quiet, decaying town, it sat on a hill, surrounded by dense woods. It was the kind of place you could disappear into, where the world outside felt distant. The air in Ashford was thick with history, heavy with secrets that the town preferred to keep buried. The house itself, though showing signs of age, had a charm that only time could give. Faded paint, creaky floors, and a high, gabled roof made it a picture-perfect setting for a family seeking to leave behind the chaos of the city. For Tom and Claire Whiteley, it was an opportunity to rebuild their lives after a turbulent few years. Their 6-year-old daughter, Emily, was the first to fall in love with the house. The moment they stepped inside, she ran through the hallways, her laughter echoing against the wooden walls, and ended up in the attic. That's where she found the doll. It was tucked away in a dusty corner, buried beneath old boxes and tattered blankets. Emily, drawn to it by some invisible force, picked it up. The doll was strange. Its porcelain skin was cracked, and its once white lace dress was yellowed with age. Its eyes were large, unblinking, and glassy, as if staring into something far beyond the room. It felt wrong. But Emily didn't care. To her, it was perfect. "That's a beautiful doll," Claire remarked as Emily came down the stairs with it in her arms. "Do you want to keep it?" Emily nodded enthusiastically, clutching it to her chest. It was as if the doll had chosen her. Tom didn't say anything, but he felt a slight chill run down his spine as he watched his daughter's infatuation with the toy. At first, the family dismissed the strange occurrences. The house was old, after all. The first sign was the doors. At night, they creaked open on their own. Soft, slow, deliberate movements that sent a chill through the rooms. Tom would close them, and the next night they would be open again, just a crack. Then the lights began flickering. They'd be fine one moment, and then flicker, flicker, darkness. The house would fall silent, save for the sounds of their own breaths. And just as quickly, the lights would return to normal,
as if nothing had happened. The noises were unsettling, but they attributed it to the house settling. Old houses made strange sounds, after all. But as days turned into weeks, the disturbances grew more pronounced. One evening, Emily stood in the doorway of the kitchen, staring at the doll as it sat on the table. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch the cold, smooth face of the doll. Tom and Claire exchanged worried glances. Emily had always been a cheerful, lively child, but now she seemed distant, withdrawn. That night, one of their neighbors, Mrs. Holloway, a sweet old woman who lived 2 doors down, was found dead in her home. The cause was unclear. Her body had been found sprawled across the floor, a look of terror frozen on her face. No signs of struggle, no obvious injuries. The authorities didn't have an explanation. It wasn't long before another neighbor, the quiet Mr. Stokes, was found in a similar state. His house was empty, the front door open, but there was no sign of what had happened. No one could figure out why these people were dying in such a strange, unexplained manner. But one thing was certain. There was something wrong with the town and with the house. The Whiteley family tried to keep their heads down, hoping the bad luck would pass, but it didn't. Emily's obsession with the doll only deepened. She would whisper to it in the dark, her voice low and eerie. Tom and Claire would often hear her in the middle of the night talking to it as if it were alive. "You're so beautiful," she would say softly, her words laced with an unsettling affection. "I'll never leave you, I promise."
As the weeks wore on, Tom couldn't ignore the strange occurrences any longer. The doll's behavior was becoming too erratic to ignore. Sometimes it seemed to change positions on its own. Other times, Tom would find its head tilted at an odd angle when he was sure it had been perfectly still just moments before. The worst of it came one night when, as Tom entered the living room, the doll's eyes seemed to follow him, its glassy stare shifting slightly as if it were tracking his every move. And then there were the whispers. At night, in the dead of sleep, Tom and Claire would hear soft murmurs coming from the direction of Emily's room. They were too faint to make out, but there was no mistaking the intent in the voice. It was coaxing Emily, calling her by name, as if trying to pull her into the shadows. One morning, Tom found Emily sitting at the breakfast table, staring at the doll. Her eyes were wide, dark rings forming under them as if she hadn't slept in days. "Tom, you need to stop playing with that doll. It's making you act strange." Emily didn't respond. She just held the doll tightly against her chest, her fingers pale and tight around it. That night, after Tom and Claire went to bed, they were jolted awake by a loud bang. They rushed down the hallway to find Emily standing in the doorway of the living room, her face pale and covered in sweat. She pointed at the doll, which had fallen to the floor. "It moved," she whispered. Tom and Claire stared at the doll, heartbeats pounding in their ears. It was just lying there, harmless, but something about the way it lay there, its eyes staring straight at them, filled them with dread. The next day, they discovered the truth. In the town's small library, they found an old news clipping from decades ago, dated 1947. It was a piece about a man named Charles Devereux, a notorious murderer who had once lived in the house. Devereux had been accused of killing several people,
but the authorities had never been able to catch him. He had disappeared without a trace. What shocked Tom and Claire the most was the discovery that Devereaux's spirit had been bound to the doll, a vessel for his murderous rage. He had cursed the doll before his death, ensuring that it would never be destroyed and that it would always need more victims. It was too late. Emily had already become too close to the doll. The bond had been formed, and the spirit had a claim on her. The Whiteleys tried to burn the doll, to break the curse, but when they set fire to it, it only smoldered for a moment before the flames died out. The doll, seemingly unharmed, was back on the table the next morning, waiting. In their desperation, they tried everything to rid themselves of it, but nothing worked. The deaths continued, and with each one, the doll grew stronger. One evening, as the family sat huddled together in fear, they heard a knock at the door. Claire opened it cautiously, only to find a small, tattered note lying on the doorstep. It was written in a shaky hand. "You cannot escape what is already inside you." It wasn't long after that Emily disappeared. The doll was gone too. The house now stands silent, abandoned, a hollow shell of the place the Whiteleys once called home. No one dares to move in. The townsfolk know better to speak of it. But sometimes, on quiet, moonless nights, when the wind is just right, you can hear faint whispers coming from the empty house, whispers that sound strangely like a child's voice and a doll's cold laughter.
The title of the story:
The Doll's Eyes Never Blink. When Emma inherited her late aunt's belongings, she never expected anything unusual. Aunt Margaret had always been a collector of strange things, antique furniture, odd trinkets, and bizarre artifacts from her travels, but none of it had ever given Emma a sense of unease. That was until she saw the doll. It sat on the top shelf of a dusty old cabinet in the attic, nestled between other antique pieces, chipped porcelain teacups, and tarnished silver spoons. The doll was small, no more than a foot tall, dressed in an old-fashioned lace dress, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to gleam in the dim light. Its face was unnervingly still, the expression locked in an eternal smile, but something about it felt wrong. At first, Emma shrugged it off. "It's just a doll," she muttered to herself, but the longer she looked at it, the more something gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't shake. No matter how long she stared at the doll, its eyes never blinked. The stillness of them unsettled her, and it felt like they were following her, watching her with an intensity she couldn't explain. She placed the doll on the mantel in the living room, near the large, cracked mirror that hung above the fireplace. She thought maybe she'd get used to it, but each time she walked past it, the doll's gaze seemed to burn through her. Every night, she'd catch herself glancing back at it, as if expecting it to move. It never did, but the stillness only made it worse. The first odd event occurred a few nights later. Emma was sitting in the living room, reading a book by the firelight, when she heard a soft creak from the hallway. She looked up, frowning, and waited for any other sounds. Nothing. But then the door to the dining room, which had been shut tight all day, slowly creaked open. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She was alone in the house.
Had she left the door ajar by accident? She couldn't remember. A chill ran down her spine, and the feeling of being watched returned. She glanced at the doll, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. No, it couldn't be. She turned away, shaking her head, and went to close the door. But just before she reached it, the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps echoed from upstairs, as if someone was walking across the floor above her. Her heart skipped a beat. No one was there. Her aunt had been gone for years. Emma's breath came in shallow bursts as she quickly locked the dining room door and retreated back to the couch, trying to calm herself. "It's just the house settling," she told herself, but the whispers in the air seemed to mock her. The following nights were no better. The footsteps grew louder, more frequent, as though someone was walking around the house, slowly, methodically, just out of sight. Then there were the whispers. Quiet at first, they seemed to emanate from the walls, just beyond the range of hearing, but loud enough for Emma to understand they were calling her name, soft, drawn out, like a lover's murmur. And every time, when she turned to look, the doll was staring back at her with its unblinking gaze. A week passed, and Emma began to feel the weight of it all. The doll, its eyes always locked on hers, its mouth never moving, seemed to grow more oppressive with every passing day. She'd been living in her aunt's old house for a month now, but the longer she stayed, the more distant she felt from reality. It was as though the house, with its creaking floors and murmurs in the walls, was feeding on her fear. That's when Emma found the journals. She was searching through her aunt's belongings in the attic, hoping to find some answer to the strange events that had been escalating. She came across a leather-bound book, aged and brittle, tucked into a drawer beside the doll. Her aunt had kept meticulous notes, descriptions of each antique, where they were bought, and the origins of the more unusual ones. But there, near the back of the journal, was a passage that caught Emma's attention.
The doll had been made by a craftsman named Abel Pharaoh, a man who lived in the late 1800s. Pharaoh was notorious for his odd creations, dolls that were too lifelike, eyes too realistic. It was said that he had a dark fascination with the dead. Some whispered that he was obsessed with capturing the souls of the departed, trapping them in his creations. It was in his later years that he began to craft dolls infused with the souls of spirits he had bound to the earth. Emma's fingers trembled as she read the next part of the entry. Pharaoh's final piece, the one he called the Watcher, was said to hold a particularly violent spirit, a woman named Eliza, who had been wronged in life and whose soul was desperate for revenge. The doll's unblinking eyes, its fixed smile, were designed to hold Eliza's spirit in place, forever watching, waiting for the next victim. Whoever owned the doll, it was said, would eventually be possessed by Eliza's vengeful spirit. Emma slammed the book shut, her heart pounding. This couldn't be true. It had to be some sick fantasy. But the whispers grew louder, the footsteps closer, and the feeling of being watched intensified. She glanced toward the mantel. The doll had moved. Not much, just a slight shift, as if its head had turned a fraction, but it was enough. The intensity of its stare felt like it was boring into her soul. She could feel Eliza's presence now, as though she were right there, behind her, breathing down her neck. Her breath quickened. Panic set in. Desperate, she grabbed the doll and rushed outside, intending to burn it in the fire pit. She tossed it into the flames and stood back, watching as the flames danced around the porcelain. But the doll didn't burn. Instead, it remained untouched by the fire, its eyes staring back at her through the smoke. Emma screamed, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Then, in that moment, she understood. The doll's eyes never blinked, not because it was cursed, but because it had always been watching, always waiting. Eliza's spirit wasn't trapped in the doll. It had never been trapped at all. It had been waiting for Emma, waiting for her to make the mistake of taking the doll in, of inviting it into her life. And now it had her. With a sudden rush, Emma collapsed onto the ground. Her eyes locked on the doll one final time. The twisted smile seemed to grow wider, and the last thing she saw before everything went dark was the doll's unblinking eyes, staring back at her as if it had been waiting for this very moment all along. And as the house settled into silence, Emma's presence faded, leaving only the soft, unsettling whispers that echoed through the empty halls. The doll, still perfectly intact, sat on the mantel, its eyes never blinking.